What's up guys, my name is Saib and welcome to episode 14. In this episode we're gonna move on with animations and do some cool things with it. We're gonna learn how to actually do some sprites. In the previous episode we've talked about functions. We went through the basics of how to set up our own frame rate and how to use request animation method, and we've tried the set interval to actually set our own frame rate, or just frames per second. And in this episode we're gonna go over to how to draw sprites. Sprites are mainly 2D visuals that we see a lot in 2D games, and I thought it's something essential that you actually should know before we go into making our own games in this series. So I thought this should be just an introduction to sprites. I think it's just the whole thing about sprites. So yeah, we're gonna learn how to do them. And mainly sprites are just frames that we actually try to shift. If you try to see one sprite that we're gonna implement in this series, for instance, this is a sprite. It has many frames. In our case, this sprite has 10 frames. And the way we actually draw that is that we slice this sprite into like 10 frames. We use the draw image method that we've talked about in the previous episode, in the images episode. And the way we do it is that we slice and shift a frame after frame to have this cool animation show up, and in which this is just simply a sprite. Let's try to actually do this in order to understand it more and see how exactly, and understand the mechanism behind it and how to implement such a thing. So okay, the first thing that we need to do is to upload or just specify the image source or the sprite source in our canvas, same as we did in the image episode. So we're just moving. The first thing that I'm going to do is create a as image object or sprite object. So I'm going to call it my sprite, and then I'm going to say new image, and then I'm going to have to specify the source. So simply my sprite, and I'm going to specify the source that way. Make sure you write the source correctly. So now I'm going to just go to assets and then /, and I called mine explosion. Check that one, explosion sprite. Alright, explosion sprite.png and single quote. Alright, now we have to add the event listener to actually know that the image got loaded, and simply you can just call my sprite and add event listener to load. We've gone through that in the images episode. You should check that one if you haven't. So okay, once it's got loaded, I'm gonna call animate function, in which is the animation for our sprite. Okay, so now let's try to come up with a definition for animate. Okay, now since I'm having 10 frames in this sprite, I can't work with 60 frames per second because it's gonna move so fast that we can't even visualize it. So I'm gonna work with 10 frames per second, or maybe 20, to actually see how the transition between these frames. So okay, so for that I'm gonna use the set timeout function method. Alright, so now we're gonna have to come up with this, and same as the set interval thing. Since I'm using 10 frames per second, I'm gonna do it 1000 over 10 that way to get it in milliseconds for each frame, the time in milliseconds for each frame. Okay, so now we have to we've talked about animation in the previous episode. We have two steps: we draw and then we clear with the clear rect method. So the first thing is that we actually clear that one, clear rect. Okay, before going into the clear rect, we have to specify some variables in order to ease the way we do this. And the first thing that we're gonna do is the frame width and height for each. Now I have this sprite in which is this one, in which is 2560 in width, divided by 10 for each frame, because I'm having 10 frames. So each frame is gonna have like 250 width and 250 height. Okay, that way we can just simply 250, and we can specify a frame height. That way I'm gonna keep it 250 the same, and then I'm gonna say the total frames to keep track of the frames. So the total frames is 10, because we're having 10 frames in here. If you try to count them, 2, 4, 10, that way. Okay, just check. Alright, now let's try to add a variable shift that we use in order to shift our frames. It's gonna start at 0, in which is the first frame, and then I'm gonna keep track of each frame by using the current frame, and that way. Okay, so now I want to clear I don't want to clear the whole canvas. I just want to clear the area where this sprite shows. So let's pick a position for the x and y coordinates for the sprite to actually show where exactly this sprite should be. So I'm just gonna make it, give it 100 by 100 for instance. And for the rectangle, I want it to be with the for each frame width and height, because as I said, I want to animate this area, in which is the sprite area, that way. I hope that makes sense. Now let's hide that way. Okay, now let's call the draw image method to actually draw our image. So first thing is we add our image object. Okay, so to understand how this exactly works, I'm gonna start at 0 for x and y, and then I'm gonna slice this by taking the width and height of the first frame, and then I'm gonna use my shift variable in here to shift our frames by just increasing the shift with the frame width plus 1. So if I'm having a frame width of 250, I'm gonna move 251 in order to get to the second frame, that one. The same goes for the other one, and the same goes for all of the other frames. So yeah, I'm gonna call shift in here, make it the x, and I'm gonna use 0 for y, since all of these frames are on the same level for the y, so I'm gonna leave it at 0. And then we're gonna have the width and height, so we have to specify the frame width and frame height, that way. And now we have to specify the position, the destination for x and y. I'm gonna leave it 100 and 100. Make sure that both of these are the same, so that they get cleared and drawn for the animation to actually work, as we said in the previous episode. And then of course for the width and height of our slicing, it's going to be the frame width and the frame height. That's simply everything. If you understand everything until now, that means you get it. So now all we need to do is the actual animation by shifting the shift variable by the frame width plus 1, for instance, to actually go to the second frame. And before increasing, so I'm going to increase my frame that way, so that we keep track of the way that we actually defined a variable for the current frame is that if we're going to make a current an if statement, if our current frame equals the total frames, in which is the 10, then we're gonna reset everything back to normal, so that the animation loops all the way, so it doesn't stop actually. So if it showed the 10 frames, it can go back again to the 0, and then 10 frames, and then go back to 0 that way. And so yeah, I hope that makes sense. And lastly, we need to call the request animation, as we did in the previous episode, the request animation frame. I'm gonna call animate, so that it actually gives us the animation loop that we talked about. Things. Alright, so okay, what exactly is happening in here is that we can see the sprite, but we can see now that there's something in this. We didn't slice the frames correctly. That's why we get this. Just, you know, this one is from the previous episode, the previous frame. So what we need to do in here is that we have to correct our frame width and height, which means that if we went back to the explosion, we can see that we're having a width of 2560. If we divided this by 10, we're gonna get a frame of 265 that way, and of course the height is gonna be 265. So if we save now, everything works just fine. So yeah, that's simply everything you need to know about sprites. If I have another sprite in here, in which is called 2, so if I try to actually just replace those, we're gonna have the other one, which exactly is the same 10 frames. So yeah, both of them are identical in order to deal with them in here. If I try to slow this down to actually see it, I want, let's say, 2 frames per second, so that actually is smaller. Now each 2 frames takes a second. If I want to play this on 60 frames per second, same as usual, you're gonna see how fast it is. So yeah, 20 may be a good want to actually keep it that way or just by 15. Okay, yeah, that way we can slow it down a bit for 8. Okay, so yeah, that's the second sprite, and let's go back to the first one to actually see it. And this is the first one. So yeah, we use sprites extensively in games. We're gonna make a lot of use for sprites in games, especially 2D. They are mainly for 2D games. So yeah, just one last thing actually before I move into just stopping this episode. If we want to download those sprites to actually try them, you can go to CraftPix. I think it's called CraftPix that way. Yeah, 2D game assets. If I just zoom in, and I think they're called animation sprites. You can find them if you just search for sprites, because I'm going to show you the package that I used, in which it's a free one. You can actually download that one. I think it's called Explosion Sprites. Okay, I don't think oh yeah, this one, it's a free one. You can download it once you actually sign in for an account, and it has all of the sprites. So we use this one and we use that one. So yeah, you can download them and try it yourself, and I'll see you in the next episode.